have to tell you that. Thank you.
So my first question I want to ask you guys, in 2016, 63% of women were eligible to vote and said that they did. They cast, or, excuse me, 63% of women who were eligible to vote said they cast their ballots in the presidential election, compared to only 59% of men. This difference, women voting more than men, has been gradually increasing over the past 40 years. This gender gap is even greater in the Black community, where 10%, there's a 10% difference of women voting at a higher rate over men. And I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts on why you think that is. I'd love to start with Halie, if possible.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. I especially want to thank Kelly and Jared. They had lent their voices to our organization's event earlier this year, and Kelly for lending your voice and your leadership for this critically important organization. Thank you so much. So why women vote more? I think the simple answer is that we have more stake in who we elect. And these stakes are felt even higher in minority communities. I think women have been historically more impacted by government interventions, more impacted by access to affordable healthcare. This drove the vote in 2018 in the most recent elections. It will likely drive the vote again in 2020. Now we have a different set of circumstances amid a pandemic and a Supreme Court ruling that we know is aiming to take away the Affordable Health Care Act right after this election. We're more impacted by decisions about reproductive rights. This drove women out to vote in 2018 after the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. It may again, after we see that we're in the third day here of the confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett. And just to reflect on that for a moment, I went to the Supreme Court hours, I live in Washington, I went hours after we heard the tragic news of the passing of the iconic Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I was on the steps of the Supreme Court and I looked around, and it was a really diverse group there that night, mourning this monumental loss of mostly women, and there were some men. And the men who were there, quite a few of them waving the pride flags for equality. And just looking around that night kind of epitomized my answer to this question. It's those who have something at stake in the decisions that will impact our future are those who show up. So today, we know amid this crisis that we're all living through that women have been even more impacted by COVID-19 than men. There's a new report out that shows that 1 in 4 women are considering downshifting their careers or leaving the workforce due to the coronavirus because of the challenge of balancing work with childcare, schools being closed. Women have been hit harder than men, including in my own home, which has been difficult to balance with 3 kids. This is the potential to reverse decades of progress for women in the workplace. And I think this will also be driving women to the polls in this election because we need leadership. So when I reflect on this election versus the last one, it's interesting to look at the polling numbers because even though Hillary was a woman, Joe Biden's numbers are higher today than Hillary's were in 2016 among women, among white women in particular. I think because of what Donald Trump represents through the lens of women, and specifically through the lens of a mother. You know, when I think about it, he is everything I don't want my children to be, everything we tell them to avoid. We want presidents to lead by example when it comes to wearing a mask or the way you treat other people. He is represented, in my view, in the view of our organization, discrimination, bigotry, misogyny, hatred. And this is one of the reasons that we have seen him hemorrhaging support among college-educated women, especially according to Politico today. It's why he said last night at his rally, "Suburban women, will you please like me?" To which we all responded, no thanks, hard pass. The night before, he threatened to kiss women. Not only is this kind of horrifying because he happened to be COVID positive just days before, but also here you have someone who's been accused of sexual misconduct by 26 people. So this is why he is down even more than he was in 2016 among women, and why we will show up. We have something at stake in this election, and we're not just showing up for ourselves, we're showing up for our kids, because he's everything we don't want our children to be.
I feel that so deeply. Thank you so much for that. I completely agree. I'm curious, Kwajalein, can I also get your thoughts on this?
Sure. I certainly would co-sign a lot of what Halie shared. I think to specifically speak to why Black women vote in such high numbers and there's such a disparity between Black men and Black women, I think in some ways, women across racial and ethnic groups are socialized to put the needs of others above themselves frequently. And I think that is more acute in the lives of Black women, that frequently they are called upon to not only think about choices as individual, as the way that they might impact them individually, but the ways that they affect a full community. They are not only caregivers for their children, but they are caregivers for their neighbors, for their grandchildren, for their cousins, for their colleagues sometimes at work. And so often, even if there is a man in the home, they are often still functioning as heads of household in many cases. Though, of course, we also know that many Black women are leading households as single parents as well. So I just think that is a part of what might contribute to what makes Black women feel that the decisions they make, they are considering much more than how it's going to impact them alone, but how it's going to impact the entire ecosystem that they function in.
I want to add to this thought too. I want to add, I'm actually going to bring up a point that, Joanne, this was made in an interview that you actually did in the Love's Discovering Truth. And the gentleman you spoke to, he brought up the biological difference between men and women is females get their periods. And he had said that he had gone through and spoke with different gynecological psychologists and asked them, can you think of a moment in a man's life that is equivalent to this event for a man? Is there anything that shapes them the way that getting our period at the ripe age of 9 to 13 shapes us? And he said that the best thing that he heard that they could come up with was when a man is told that he is incontinent and when a man is told he can no longer drive.
Right.
And this is because he said that this is the first time in a man's life that a man is told that he doesn't have control. And so there's something that happens to us women. We can look at it as an advantage. We can look at it as we have an affinity for change. We are, Kelly, you put it so beautifully the other day, we are literally forced to learn how to go with the flow at a very young age. And so we have an affinity to getting involved in a democracy that changes with the social tide. We are used to taking advantage of that right to vote and taking advantage of being an advocate for change. So I think that's a part of it too. And I want to go to you next, Joanne. I want to ask you specifically, because you do so much incredible work. You go to many different continents, you work with so many young women, and you take them at this ripe age and you teach them leadership skills. You've worked with the Women's International Leadership Summit that deals with fostering female leadership. And I want to hear your thoughts on how do you go about encouraging women? How do we go about encouraging the females around us to get involved? And how can we possibly even encourage these females to influence the men in their lives to get involved?
Well, first of all, I wanted to just say that, in my work with hundreds of young women around the world, I really experienced what research also supports, that if you educate a woman, if you empower a woman, she in turn not only helps her family, but she helps her community, she helps her country, and perhaps her world. Why? Just because of what everybody's been saying already. Because women by nature are totally connected to the communities in which they live. They know what's going on. They raise the children. They go to the schools. They shop at the stores. And, they make about 85% of consumer decisions. They see the injustices that are all around them. They're affected by every issue. And consequently, they care about things like education, community health, the environment, civil justice, safety, sensible gun legislation. They think and care about the overall welfare of our society. You can say that's true in almost every culture I've ever worked in. And voting is just one way to impact that. Of course, running for office or other things like that are other ways. Many more women are running for office. This year alone, 492 women put themselves up to run for the House of Representatives, US here. And as you know, local and state elections have women all over the place. Even here where I live in Naples, many of the candidates are women on the Democratic ticket. But overall, women with education consistently have turned out to vote. But the interesting thing is really even less educated women vote significantly higher than men. I mean, we found that like 60% of white women without a 4-year degree voted in 2016. Compared with only 56% of white men. But when you, like you pointed out, when you look at Black women without a college degree, 61% of them voted in 2016 compared to only 50% of Black men. So that's 11-point gap, Why is it? Why do they do that? Because they get it. They really get it. Their lives, our lives, and our livelihoods, as you all pointed out, are really going to be affected by whoever gets elected. And if you look at COVID and what it's done, as Halie said, 800,000 American women have already decided that they have to quit their jobs because they cannot balance taking care of kids and their jobs. Kids are at home with schooling and stuff like that. And many of them are single mothers. And as you pointed out, 1 in 4 of the general population of women are thinking right now, because of this pandemic, of quitting their jobs. We are going to be set back by that. One more thing I'd like to say, among the educated women, the Democratic Party holds an edge. About 51% of women without college degrees still identify as Democrats, where 42% identify as Republicans. And men without a degree are, more likely to be Republicans. So there's a marked gap here, and the GOP is gaining a lot of men without degrees. So your question, how do we influence men? How do we influence men? Well, in 2020, it's really interesting how sex and gender are really predominant determinants of this vote. As you know, the issues affecting all of us are on the ballot, such as the right to control your own body, healthcare, childcare, equal pay, job security, and large numbers of women voters are really going to impact this campaign. The far right men tend to be very anti-feminist. That's on their agenda, anti-feminist. The very far right women, some of whom you see right now demonstrating outside of the Supreme Court, tend to be very conservative. And those of us, the majority of people, who really are more fluid in terms of our value systems that have masculine and feminine value systems, tend to be more liberal in our voting behavior. But COVID accentuates all of it, because who's taking care of the kids? Who's taking care of the sick? And who's taking care of the elderly? Everybody's affected by this, both men and women. So women can sort of point to men and say, who's going to take care of the kids? We all have to worry about this, and we need to change the government to address it.
With so much of your work, you have such an amazing career and spent so much of your time, and you talk so much about how these one-on-one interactions and these one-on-one connections are so important in moving the needle forward. I'm curious of how in this we're in a Zoom meeting right now, and we're trying to live in an age where so much of our information comes from the digital world, and we're getting so much misinformation through that. You look at from the debates that we're watching to you scroll on your phone, and so much of the information where people are getting is simply false. And we see it time and time again that truth is relative, and the way that we can demystify a lot of these falsities is by having these one-on-one conversations. Halie, Kwajalein, I'd love if you guys could jump in too of how we begin to tackle, again, motivating each other when there's so much false information flying around.
Sure. I mean, I think, in some ways, I think this also speaks to my earlier point. I can remember during like the early phases of the Affordable Care Act, how there was an entire campaign targeting women to say, you are the people who will influence the men in your life to go and seek healthcare, because they won't do it if you don't tell them to do it. Yeah. You are the one who will drag your partner to the polls. You are the one who will help them to see everything on their ballot. And so I think while it is admirable and important that we continue to be the folks who influence and affect change, it is also a burden to be the person who has to hold the information for all of these other adults in your life.
Yeah.
But I think to your point, I mean, I think there's been a lot of really creative ways that folks have tried to not just focus on, the candidates, but really talk to people about the issues at stake, help people to understand their relationship with people who are making decisions on their behalf. I think those are the kinds of conversations that I would like to see happen more, and not just every 4 years, so that people really have a more intimate relationship and understanding about how government structures work, how decisions get made, and what our role to play is. Because there's so much just like, vote because we told you to, vote because people died, vote because it's your duty, as opposed to really engaging people around the things that are important to them, the things that they value, the things that they find harmful, so that they can see an actual pathway to getting change. I will just say, in my experience, not just again in 2016, but even going back to 2014, and particularly in midterm elections, when there's a lot of things at stake on the ballot then too, we often hear from folks, why vote? Because I voted and my life didn't change. A lot of people get really disenchanted by the fact that their everyday life doesn't change dramatically when the president's seat changes hands, or even when the Congress changes hands. And I think in part, I also have a little bit of critique for how much emphasis and energy is put into the presidential races, when people need to be more engaged and better understand their local elections, understand what their governors are doing, what the sheriffs are doing, what the district attorneys are doing, and understand that they have a tremendous amount more influence in those elections than they do in a presidential year. There's no electoral college in the way in electing your governor. So those are some of the things that I think I would like to see as we continue to get people more civically engaged, is to sort of deepen their understanding and not rely on the basic civics 101 that we got in our primary education.
Joanne, you look like you wanted to jump in. Were you trying to get?
I just want to say one thing, people who do get involved in issues, like look at the high school kids from Parklands who really took on the gun legislation issue, and they learned so much about the government. They are really, really educating themselves about how the government works, how you get legislation passed, why vote, and how to organize, and they have been doing it despite COVID. And as you know, many young people have done it around the environment and other issues, other issues that we could think of. So I think once people get involved in an issue that they're passionate about, that they're connected to on a visceral level, and then they start to realize how the government affects that, and they have to change the legislation, they have to change their representatives in Congress, etc. They learn a lot fast.
This is a great segue into my next question. I want to talk about single issue voters, because we know a lot of people are motivated by voting is personal. We are motivated by a lot of times one single issue. And we want to discuss this because Hysterical Women's Society specifically looks at reproductive rights. And that's a big reason of why we got founded. So this is an important subject to us in particular. So what I'm curious is, do you guys think that women fall more into the category of being single issue voters, knowing that we oftentimes lead with an empathetic heart and get to the polls for those reasons? And if so, what are those issues?
I'll start just because representing a Jewish democratic organization. They're picking up on the last question in terms of disinformation. There are a lot of misconceptions out there, even about the Jewish vote, similar to perhaps the women's vote, that we as Jewish voters are one-issue voters. And frankly, the president himself kind of perpetuates a lot of these false narratives by referring to us frequently as kind of homogenous one-issue voters who are solely driven by Israel. And the reality is quite different. The reality is that the Jewish vote is, Jewish voters in general are a quite diverse group, but Israel is not driving the Jewish vote. In fact, when we look at polling over time, actually consistently, it's domestic policy issues, not any different than what is driving the American electorate writ large, that are driving the Jewish electorate, mostly access to affordable health care, gun safety, the rise of hatred in our country, anti-Semitism, and COVID being the two issues that are new for this election. Of course, we didn't face the rise of hatred and anti-Semitism the way we have in the past 4 years in 2016. And of course, nobody faced a pandemic until now. But, so when I look at the Jewish vote, it's important that we do try to kind of dispel the misconceptions that are out there about it. And I think similarly, the women's vote is, we're not quite one-issue voters. I think we're voting on a lot of issues, but I think, of course, there are issues that matter more to women because it impacts our lives more. However, I would caution against putting any segment or subset of the electorate into a box like that, because I'm frequently out there saying, no, we're not homogenous, we're not voting in Israel, we're not disloyal. There are a lot of misconceptions out there. Again, a lot perpetuated by the president himself.
Yeah. I'm curious then to hear, do you feel, so we're getting further and further away from people just voting on one single issue and less people that are swing voters. But what we are seeing a move towards is a lot of people are straight ticket voters. And rather than getting informed about different issues, getting informed in their local elections, and where a lot of times that's where you actually see those different issues being tackled, people will vote in this one presidential election down the ticket and not actually get informed about anything else. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that switch. If we're moving away from single issue voters, the switch to down the ticket.
If I could jump in, if how many of you were at the Women's March? I mean, think of it was a gut reaction to some of the things that this administration stands for, right? But if you were at the march way back in 2016, 2017, every issue was there. It wasn't just one issue. There were issues of reproductive rights. There were issues of immigration. People were horrified by children being thrown into cages. There were issues of same-sex marriage. There were issues about the environment. There were people all over the spectrum of issues realizing that it all matters, right? And that we're not all just one issue, and that we're one. I mean, I thought it was wonderful as everybody respected each other so much at those marches. In fact, there's a march Saturday, by the way, on the 17th. But I think there are some people who are straight on one issue, but I think a lot of people see that our lives are at stake here, that the quality of our lives and what we care about. We're looking for much different leadership. We're looking for empathy. We're looking for integrity. We're looking for honesty, and we don't have it. So I think people are, seeing the big picture. Our lives are really perhaps in jeopardy in terms of the way we want to live.
And also seeing that all these things connect. You can't really be a single issue voter because everything intersects.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, to paraphrase Audre Lorde, we can't have single issue struggles because we don't have single issue lives.
Yeah.
And so it does us no good to focus only on one sort of like narrow aspect of our humanity and just discard the rest as if that will just be dragged along behind us. History will show us that that has never worked in our favor. And so, you know, to part of your second question, I do think that it's really important for us to examine the candidates with a fine-tooth comb. I think it's really important for us to really understand their history of decision-making, the things that they have promised, so that we can appropriately hold them accountable once they take office. I tell folks that, you know, when we're working in communities all the time, that elected officials work for you. You are their boss. You have hiring and firing decisions. You give them performance reviews as they are your representatives, but you are the one who calls the shots. And so if we're not informed about what we can expect from them once they have taken the duty to govern, they will listen to someone if they're not listening to us. And so I really think that it's important for us to not be so mired to party and really look at individuals. It is, again, just thinking about the conversations that we have on doors when we're out in the community, it is challenging to get people excited about a sort of like plain vanilla yogurt person who does not stand for anything, who just says, I'm not as bad as who was here before. That's not motivating to a lot of people who may not be sort of swing voters, but are apathetic, who are not invested, who again have seen presidents change and seen their life circumstances continue to be poor. So having a candidate who can really speak to the things that are affecting their lives in the moment, and who is accessible to them in a way that they can affect change in the future. I think those are the things that I would encourage us to try to bring to our folks, the people in our circles who are not connected to this election. I often go back to, we had 8 years of a very progressive president, and a lot of really terrible things happened during those 8 years. There was, tremendous decimation of abortion access across the country. There continued to be Black people killed in the streets with no accountability for their murders. That spans presidents. That is a function of much more than just one seat of office. And so I really am hopeful that we continue to get people who may have been activated during this period of time to go deeper in the future so that we can continue to refine our process going forward.
I want to ask you if you just started to touch on it when you were talking about some of the abortion legislation that got moved through. I'm curious about what are people voting for when they're voting anti-abortion? Because I think we sum it up to just it being about abortion, but it's such a wide variety of issues that affect real lives. And I know it's the work you do, and I want to hear more about your stance on that.
Sure. So I think you're exactly right, because we often see that the same people who put forth legislation that restricts or attempts to ban abortion are also people who stand in the path of people getting access to consistent contraception, stand in the path of people getting comprehensive sex education. They are also oftentimes the same people who push forward anti-immigration legislation, anti-queer and trans legislation. That it's fascinating to me how there are folks who oppose abortion who really seem to have mastered intersectionality, because they see all those issues as connected in a way that we don't always have the language to communicate from our perspective. So I think that the underlying thread for me is about, patriarchy and misogyny, that this is about the control of a population of people, whether that is across gender, race, economic status, or some combination thereof. This idea that only certain people should be allowed to move freely, build wealth, and make decisions. and that others should either conform to the choices of those who have been deemed to hold that power or be pushed out of the way. That's the way it feels often from our perspective. Because again, if you would think that a very common sense response to, I really wish that there were fewer abortions, would be, let's make sure that everybody has access to all the information they need to make choices about their sex lives and their reproduction so that there are fewer unplanned pregnancies. That is a 1 + 1 = 2 equation. But that's not the way it works. It's like, actually, I want to control how and when and under what circumstances you have sex at all. And make sure that it's only in the confines of the way that I have been taught is appropriate. And so really for us, reproductive justice is about full bodily autonomy and the ability to self-determine, to make choices about how you want to live your life with a full, like, human rights available to you. No obstacles, no restrictions. That's really what we're fighting for. Abortion is just a small piece of that. There's so many other parts that contribute to our ability to self-determine.
Thank you so, so much for that. Oh my gosh. I want to move on to the next question because we're running out of time. I'm in love with everything that you guys are saying. My next question for you guys is, what are some of the challenges and obstacles that are preventing more women from voting? And what can we do to help them overcome them? Can I start with you, Joanne?
Well, I mean, I'm a feminist, and I hate to even say this, but when I do calls to try to get people to vote, register to vote, I find a lot of women are deferring to men that they live with. They feel they don't know enough. Or they don't really care. They don't like politics. They don't like the politicians who are running. They have no connection to them, and so they don't want to vote. I mean, there are a lot of people like that. So as Laura Lee knows, I've been working with the League of Women Voters down here, which is a really strong organization here. It's a nonpartisan organization, but it was founded 100 years ago for that very reason, to sort of educate the new women who are going to be able to vote after the 19th Amendment on their rights, on what it means to vote, and on the issues that affect their lives. And we're still doing that. I mean, I think the main thing that needs to be done to get more women to vote is to educate them, inform them, get them in knowledge is power. And a lot of people don't realize that, the issues are their own issues. All issues are women's issues. And, so we try very hard to reach out to people. We inform them about various positions that we take issue by issue. We don't necessarily do it along partisan lines. We take a look at the issue, like you were saying earlier about legislators. You take a look at the legislator. They might vote positively on certain issues and not on others. You should really do your homework, understand what's at stake. So, I think that's an approach that needs to be taken if you want to get more women involved. I mean, 100 years ago, when women were given the vote, 20 million women were given political freedom. Imagine that. It was the biggest change ever in voting. But we still have the power to vote. We are 51% of the population, but we're way more than that in terms of the voting power. So one of our messages this year is women power the vote. We power the vote. And if women can vote on large numbers, we can actually, change things towards lives that we want to live.
I hear that. Halie, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So, just picking up on that in terms of men potentially influencing women, I'll tell a brief story. The 2018 elections was really remarkable for many reasons, but in my home district, Michigan's 8th district, Lansing, Michigan, a woman, Alyssa Slotkin, flipped a seat that had been a Republican held for 18 years. And it was a Republican held for 18 years, frankly, because it was quite gerrymandered. So the electorate hadn't changed. But how did she flip the seat? She flipped it by winning over women who had supported Donald Trump. And she started noticing that every week at the same time, there was the same group of women who would show up at our headquarters. It was like 10 women, and they would show up at the same time and they would leave at the same time. And she asked them, a few weeks into this, like, what's going on here? You guys we must know each other. Is this coordinated? And they said, oh, this is our book club. Their husbands didn't know that they were doing this. They had supported Donald Trump in 2016. They were influenced by their husbands, and they were done. And they were volunteering for Alyssa at exactly the same hour every week as part of their book club. It was power in numbers. They brought each other there. And I think it's a good demonstration of when we're there for each other, when we bring each other, when we come together to these things. I think that it shows the peer-to-peer organizing really works, and they show that this is actually how Obama really successfully won in 2008. It's the peer-to-peer network. So when women are talking to other women, when younger voters are talking to other younger voters, and this is actually what we as an organization are trying to do. We've hired 30 student fellows to speak to other students to get out that vote. That makes a difference. And it's also about empowering others, like the women that brought those other women to the book club. Empowering them to make a difference.
Kwajalein?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are also sometimes some additional obstacles that folks face, sort of, again, across the different demographics of women. So we know that voter suppression tactics are very real and often very successful. I often tell people that you can draw a straight line from voter suppression to the abortion ban that passed in Georgia. It doesn't deviate. It is a straight line, and it is a decades-long plan. And so, again, in the in-between presidential elections, being able to focus on the ways that the state legislature and governor make decisions about voting access, make decisions about polling places, make decisions about early voting, make decisions about absentee voting. All of those things influence our ability to choose our representatives in the long run. And so I think those are things, when we think about single issue voters, if we had any single issue, voting access should be it, because that is the pathway through which we are able to affect all of the other change that we desire. So I think that is certainly something that we want to continue to pay attention to, is like, who has the ability to vote with ease and who has to stand in line for 11 hours. The first day of early voting in Georgia, there were people who were reporting 11, 13, 15 hours in line. Standing in line for that long, having to take time off work, time away from childcare, a myriad of things in order to exercise what should be a very easy and simple and clear process. Those are some of the obstacles that stand in the way of some people being able to vote consistently. If you have shift work and you can't take off on November 3rd,
right.
So we made a decision as a clinic to close on November 3rd and make Election Day a holiday, a paid holiday for all of our staff going forward, not only so people would have the ability to vote, but also so our staff would have the ability to volunteer as poll workers if they so chose.
Right, if they wanted us to get involved, they make it easier, but we see that there's so many obstacles that they put in the path. And another example, only 33% of women have proper documentation. We see women often change their last names 90% of women change their last names in order to get married. If you get divorced and you move states,
That's right.
don't have the documentation to get registered to vote. And it's last minute. Oftentimes you find out this information. There's so many roadblocks that are put in our path. It is often the females that are in charge of the household and have the maternal responsibility. So if you can't find childcare, if you can't afford it, if you can't go to the DMV, there's so many roadblocks that we have to talk about those in advance so we can help each other elevate our vote and get our voices out there. So thank you for bringing up all those points. It's really important to know.
There's a great documentary right now, I think it's on Prime, called All In, by Stacey Abrams, about all the ways that our voter rights have been eroded, are being eroded as we speak. I recommend it to everybody. It's a little bit heavy, depressing to realize that we're really being challenged here.
but important to know so you can combat it. It starts with that education, so you're not shocked when you show up to the polling place and you get turned around. You want to know in advance. That's how we combat it. So thank you for that recommendation.
Yeah.
My last question for you ladies before we turn it over to our wonderful, wonderful viewers, I want to know, what are the differences and similarities in voting trends among women in different cultural backgrounds? We live in a wonderful America that has many different people, many different cultural backgrounds, many different things that motivate them to get to the polls. What are different trends that you guys think that you've seen when it comes to different women and how they vote?
Well, I'd like to say that I don't think you can lump every person of a different culture in one voting block. They all think and act differently. Some are conservative, some are liberal, some are rich, some are poor, some are struggling, single mothers, some are happily married. And so this intersectionality is really more of a determinant of how people feel about voting, because rather than just being from a specific culture. For example, education, people realize that education matters, class matters, age matters, country of origin matters, international experience matters. If you look at a professional woman who owns a business, she may find her business needs are completely different than, say, a single mom of the same culture. Here in Southwest Florida, there are first generation immigrants who come to the U.S. and, maybe they've fled their country because of economic difficulties or political hardship, and they may have limited education. They became citizens. They work in the service sectors, but they're worried about keeping their families afloat, having enough education for their children, getting job security. That's really different than, say, a woman from a certain culture who's married an American and who has a job in finance and lives in New York City. I mean, that's a really different kind of approach to thinking about voting. So I think you can't necessarily group everybody together, although, in terms of counting votes, they often do that. For example, we measure voters by, historically, they've turned out in different ways, and black and white voters are definitely vote more than Hispanic and Asian Americans, for example. The gender gap is widest among the black voters, as you pointed out, where really almost 10 percentage points are between men and women there. So the black women are really a formidable voting bloc right now. One other thing I wanted to point out that sort of respond earlier to what somebody said was, historically we heard that 53% of white women voted for Trump. And in August of this year, they did the Pew Research study pointed out that it really wasn't that high. It was more like 47% of white women, but still it was a higher percentage of white women who voted for Trump than in the national average. It's 48% of women on the national average voted for Hillary Clinton. So there's some, there are some ways to measure votes based on gender, but based on culture. But I think it's hard to clump everybody together in one big group.
A little more complicated than that.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No,
Halie.
you please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to offer, I will say that while I completely agree that, each, sort of racial group or ethnic group is not a monolith, there are certain issues I think that are more acute in different communities. And so I think that that's something that we can continue to watch. I think this year, in addition to the ways that the pandemic has affected different communities, we've also seen this very specific way that this most recent racial uprising has resonated with communities in different ways, and sort of watching how it has peaked and in some ways flattened. But some of those issues around like systemic racism, are going to be consistent issues for communities of color, regardless of the people who are on the ballot. And so being able to like hold those things forward and prioritize them in our voting decisions has been consistent through several decades. I mean, you can trace this all the way back through before the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, this is a part of the ways that Black communities have organized to say, we understand the way that systemic racism is pervasive and that we have to be active combatants. We have to actually move in the opposite direction of the ways that racism will take us. And so I am hopeful that that is becoming more consistent across other ethnic groups, that more folks who don't identify as Black are starting to see the ways that racism and white supremacy impact them as well, and are voting in along those lines too. To say that this is not just about police brutality, but this is about the way that racism seeps into all of the systems and institutions that we hold dear, and how we want to dismantle that over time. So again, I am hopeful that there is more ways that issues that feel like they only affect one community start to become more of a priority across difference.
I would sure. I mean, when it comes to this election, I'm watching closely, especially now that Trump is back on his speaking circuit, kind of what's said each night. And the messages coming from the two candidates about this very issue just could not be more different. When Kamala Harris, for example, was running for president, she talked a lot about what she called her 3 a.m. agenda, which really the bottom line was there's so much more that unites us than divides us. We are waking up at 3 a.m. thinking about the same things. It's about, the well-being of our families. It's about equal pay and healthcare. And she actually used to say, fighting for relief for your families that are like yours. That's what I would do. Similarly, Biden also is talking about more what unites us. And, it's really the antithesis of what we hear on the other side in terms of a message about divisions and fear and vilification. So, I do think that especially in this moment when we're talking so much about healthcare and it's so critical amid a pandemic, and, there's a lot of talk of even about pre-existing conditions. And frankly, now 7 million plus more of us Americans now have a new pre-existing condition in COVID. Those who have been sickened by this virus. It is important to think about what unites us. I still think of it as the 3 a.m. agenda because frankly, not a lot of us are sleeping so well these days. And, those are the same issues. I know obviously there are a lot of cultural differences, but, I do think that especially amid crisis, which let's face it, our country is in, there is more that unites us. And I do think that is also what's going to drive us to the polls.
I just want to add one thing. I think I agree that a lot of younger women of color are very motivated by Black Lives Matter and the issues there, and really expect change. And that does unite women of various cultures around that issue.
I appreciate, though, you both pointing out, though, it's important to also focus on the things that unite us, because at the end of the day, what brings us to the polls, we're all trying to just get basic human rights on the ballot. It's simple, and that's universal with everyone that we encounter, and that's what we need to constantly remind ourselves of. So I appreciate you both bringing up those points.